Hello and welcome back to the YouTube channel. My name is Etta Grace, and today I have brought back onto the YouTube channel my good friend Katie Koontz, or Kee Koontz. I read two of her books that released in November and December, respectively, called Coaltown and I Died in the Summer of '85. And they're both really great, so we're going to be talking about them today. So thank you for speaking with me, Katie.
Thank you for having me. It was a treat talking with you before, and I'm excited to do it again.
This is actually our third interview together. As I was looking back through a Discord conversation setting up this phone call, you were the very first interview that I did on my blog, and that was back in 2021, so we've come a long way since then. But could you tell us a bit about yourself and what you write?
I am I'm an editor and a freelance ghostwriter for work, and I spend any time I'm not at work doing these novels. I like to write stories that focus on close familial bonds or stories that focus on dedicated close romances. Things that really discuss or get into the meat of human connection and how that affects and drives your decisions and your motivations, which you see a lot of in Coaltown and I Drowned in the summer of '85. Um, Genre wise, I do like writing horror or horror adjacent the most, especially creature features or anything with werewolves. But anything that gives me a chance to get into how people think, how they act, things like that pique my interest the most.
Yeah, that's awesome. And the last interview that we did was for your werewolf novel Hell, which is about three brothers, and I absolutely love that one. So, the first couple questions that I have for you are talking about Coal Town, which is the first book that you released last year. And that's about Andrew and a bunch of his friends who go on a winter camping vacation trip to a cabin in the Alaskan wilderness, and then everything very quickly goes very wrong when they decide to investigate an abandoned mine to get video footage for Andrew's senior thesis film. So, Coal Town has monsters and werewolf adjacent creatures in it, and Hell has werewolves featuring heavily prominently in it. And so, my first question is how do you keep these two different creature features distinct with the world building while still making them really unique books and paying homage to the original iconic werewolf feat?
Well, when it comes to the initial planning stage, I actually don't keep that in mind. I like werewolves and I like creatures that, like in Coaltown, the gorehounds are very adjacent to them in appearance. I think that offers a lot. It's an aesthetic that I really like. It's a creature I really like. So I'll often start just with that kind of image in mind, and then I let the characters themselves and the plot as it unfolds kind of develop the creatures and their unique traits for me.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you have something else you were going to say?
Yes, I'm so sorry. Your thing froze for a moment, and I was making sure I hadn't totally lost you.
All good, no worries.
Um, just that, I the big driving force with them is they get the characters moving. So as long as the creature gets the character moving, then the story can kind of say what it means from that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They serve as the inciting incident and then the driving motivation throughout the story to keep surviving and to keep growing as characters. So in Coal Town,
Exactly.
we not only have Andrew, but we also have a fairly large cast of side characters. And at one point, Andrew sits down and does interviews with each of them for his film. So how did you keep track of everyone while you were writing to make sure you didn't accidentally forget a character in a scene or make sure that they all had equal amounts of speaking time? And will they be getting more development in the next book because Coal Town is part of a series?
Well, keeping track of them was actually really hard. This is the first novel I've done with such a large cast. And when I sit down to write, my first goal in the first draft is to just get the big scenes down on paper. So I'd read through the second time and I'd go, wow, I don't have Cass anywhere in this scene. I have Austin in two places at once. And it came down to leaving a lot of notes to myself as I wrote that it's been too long since you've seen someone or you've seen someone in too many scenes. So a lot of trial and error and a lot of characters that did get forgotten in the first draft. Um, in the second book, the characters are all going to get a lot more development. I think that a character, even if they don't change themselves over the course of the story, how the reader views them should change over the course of the story. So my goal with the sequel book, Gorehound, will be to take the characters we were introduced to in Coaltown and show a deeper side of them, maybe what was under the first page.
That's really good writing advice, that even if the character doesn't change, that the reader's perception of them should change. I've never heard it quite worded like that before, but that's a really clever bit of writing advice that I'll be sure to incorporate moving forward. I have to say, my favorite side character, I'm forgetting her name now because I read this 2 months ago, but the one who's a nurse who they find like this really weird looking skull, and her first instinct isn't to be like, ew, gross. Her first instinct is to go poke at it and be like, what's that? This cranium is like shaped oddly and doesn't follow any natural specimens. I thought that was so funny because my sister's a nurse, and the number of times I send her weird questions for writing is ridiculous, and then she responds with, "You're terrible, but let me look that up." Um, so I thought that was a great representation of the nursing profession with my personal experience with my sister, and I thought it was really great.
I'm glad to hear you liked it. That would be Steph, and she's actually one of my favorite characters to write for, even though she's technically not the starring character whose point of view we follow. I just thought she was so much fun.
Steph, yeah, I remember now. Yeah, she's great. So, Coaltown and I Died in the Summer of '85 both have very like moody atmospheric descriptions. And so I was wondering, what do you focus on when you're writing your settings and descriptions to build up to a certain kind of mood or tone?
Well, I actually focus on the character themselves. It doesn't really matter what the setting is if it doesn't match the character who's seeing it. So in one scene, there's a big chase and Andrew falls. And my goal with that, the way I established or tried to establish the tension through it, is by narrowing in on basically the big three things that he would think about: the feeling of the snow soaking into his jeans as he falls, the sound of the gorehound behind him breaking branches, and the fact he can no longer see Austin. So you can expand on that in slower scenes and still focus on what the character finds tense rather than what you as like the writer finds tense. And basically that's basically what I try to keep in mind in each of the scenes I write.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, framing it through the character's perspective and what they would choose to focus on. Of course, Coaltown takes place in the winter in Alaska, and so it's cold and snowy and desolate and remote and just a very hostile kind of environment because it's storming in Alaska, and nobody wants to be out in a storm in Alaska. Whereas I Drowned in the Summer of '85 takes place in the summer at a lake near a summer camp. And so even though they're wildly different atmospheres, you're able to build up such a just good vibes. Like as you're reading it, like you get immersed so easily in the story. And I really admired your ability to do this while I was reading it. So that kind of leads into my next question. Do you like the cold weather or do you prefer summertime? And was it easier to write these stories when the weather was cooperating with you or not?
Well, first, thank you. I'm glad you liked how it came across. But as far as the question goes, I don't like the cold. I I think I've just spent too much time in Florida. I like the heat. I like bright, clear, sunny skies, and I write best on those days. The colder I am, the less interested in sitting down and typing I am. So when the weather cooperated, that was definitely the better typing days. And and on the days when it didn't, that's when music comes into play for me, where I have a soundtrack I put together for each story that kind of supplements the mood of the story, whether it's the more melancholy vibes that you would get in a winter setting or something a bit more upbeat if you're trying to get that summer feeling going. And I use that to kind of make up for the weather.
That makes a lot of sense. This wasn't a question on my list, but are you willing to share any songs from those playlists? Because I love music, writing to music.
I absolutely am. For I Drowned in the Summer of '85, I think it has a 9 or 10 song playlist. And I actually have it here on my phone. I can never remember the names of them. But where is it? Terrible with song names. I am so sorry.
No worries. Take your time.
Here we go. For I Drowned in the Summer of '85, the main songs on it that I think represented the mood all the way through would be American Pie by Don McLean, The Calling by The Amazing Devil,
Yes.
and Rocks in the Box by the December.
I love The Amazing Devil, and The Calling is one of my favorite songs. That's on the Runaways playlist, and there's one scene that I wrote that's from Cecilia's point of view, and it's a bit of a flashback for spoilery backstory stuff, and I'm very excited for you to read that scene because it's heavily inspired by The Calling, and slipping tiny bits of song lyrics into the prose was a really fun challenge in that scene. So, excellent taste in music, my friend.
So excited. I have been eagerly waiting to see more about the new draft of Runaways.
I am 2 chapters from the end, and I'm working from home tomorrow, so hopefully I'll finish it tomorrow, and I'll have the beta post ready to go by Friday or Saturday. Hopefully, we'll see.
Well, very excited.
So with that, I will shift into asking my second set of questions about I Drowned in the Summer of '85. For a bit of backstory about this book, for those who haven't read it, Jacob West died 15 years ago at Camp Green Hills, drowning during a midnight swim in the lake. And Bobby Kent, now 15 years later, is trying to help his brothers fix the camp up and turn it into a legacy so that they can reopen it for a new generation of kids. But the guilt that he's harbored for the past 15 years is getting in the way of that, and Jacob's ghost is getting in the way of that. So ghosts are a little bit of a different kind of monster than vampires or werewolves, where they're not really a monster, but kind of a manifestation of the afterlife, which a lot of spiritualities believe in. So do you believe in ghosts, or have you had any supernatural, paranormal, ghostly encounters before?
While I can't say I've had any encounters myself, I absolutely do believe in ghosts. I think the world is too big and too wild, and there's just too much in it to go, that doesn't exist. From a writer's standpoint, it's fun to think about. From a personal standpoint, I just have always felt that, of course, there's something else going on somewhere. Too many people would say otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Ghosts are one of my favorite supernatural creatures, so I really love this book. Jacob's apparitions to Bobby are reliving the night that he dies in this kind of like a time loop. So as you wrote this scene by scene, writing the same scene essentially over and over again, how did you continue progressing Bobby's story and character development when he and Jacob are both literally stuck in the past?
The time loop element is actually one of my favorite parts of I Drowned in the Summer of '85. It wasn't there originally either. When I first had the idea, it was just a ghost story. It was just something terrifying happens. But as I wrote for it, I realized that that was the entirely wrong sort of ghost story. This is about grief, which is what sort of causes the repetition. It's being stuck in that one moment. And as such, the only way for it to progress is for Bobby's character to start dealing with that grief. So that's where his brothers come in and the familial connection, whereas they sort of force him to confront this part of his past, as being in the camp forces him to confront this part of the past. That changes the grief that he's feeling, which kind of allows the time loop to progress and change itself.
I'm surprised to hear that the time loop wasn't in the original version of the story. So that's really cool to hear how it changed and developed as you went along and wrote it. And you mentioned on the familial relationship between the Kent brothers, and that leads into my next question. That one of my favorite scenes was Jean essentially kidnapping Bobby and being like, "You're getting in this car, and I'm not letting you out until we have a talk because you're not acting right." So can you discuss what kind of roles did you know what roles you wanted the brothers to play, and what are their relationships with Camp Green Hills?
I did from the very start. It comes down a lot to my own relationship with my sister, and that drives a lot of my interactions and influences in how the siblings I write are portrayed. And from the very start, I knew it had to be a set of three. It's Bobby, the youngest, who doesn't deal with anything. He certainly has not dealt with what happened to Jacob. And then you have Jean, the oldest, who was meant to fill the role of the hard knock, ghosts aren't real, but grief is. And yep, that's something you have to face and talk about. And Harvey is the middle child. He's kind of the bridging point between the two thoughts. His experience and influence in the book would be the talking point, the fact he provides that first instance of thinking about what happened. And of course, turning around and telling their big brother that something's going on. And he brings back the connection to Camp Green Hills because he's looking to constantly move forward, which is essentially the lesson that Bobby needs to learn.
Yeah, that's great. I love how they all become foils for each other. And this reminds me of when we talked about your book Hal, which was another set of three brothers, and how the relationship between the three brothers and Hal is it's very different because they're dealing with a very different problem and they're also stressed out teenagers. Um, than the relationship between the three brothers in this book. But there's also a lot of similarities in that you have like the big brother who's trying to look out for the ones who don't want to confront their problems, and at the end of the day that they're all there to support each other even if they're not always the best at communicating their feelings. And I really like how you write your sibling relationships, so I love seeing more of that in this book.
Thank you. It's definitely one of my favorite dynamics to play with. I think there are so many layers to being siblings, to pushing each other and fighting with each other. In I Drowned in the Summer of '85, Jean and Bobby absolutely spend quite a few chapters not necessarily getting along. And I think that's a really pivotal part of that sibling experience to show. And it makes the fact that at the end of the day, when they are there for each other, that much more realistic and a little more meaningful, I think.
Yeah, that they're able to work past their differences and come to see eye to eye about these things.
I tried very hard. The second part of your question was about Camp Greenhill and their relation to it. And I tried with that. My intention was that I've certainly never been to a place like Camp Greenhill as a child, and I know a lot of people haven't, but it was almost meant to be its own to relate to in the fact that it's the childhood spot you have to go back to at some point. It's your parents' house. It's the road you used to meet your friend on, and maybe like Jean going back there doesn't bother you at all. And maybe like Harvey going back is something you look forward to and use as your stepping off point. There's also plenty of people who have Bobby's thoughts on it, which is things just didn't go right and you don't want to go back. There's so much grief attached to it, but you're also always going to be there until you figure out how not to be and how to accept that as something that happened and you can move on from. So they were each supposed to all have their own interaction and experience with the camp as well in that way.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. The different ways of framing the past. And I hope that this book helps people who might be struggling with their own grief or struggling watching somebody going through grief, and that it kind of gives them the tools that they need to address that. I really loved reading it, and I hope that you're able to convey that message to other people too. I hope other people enjoy it as much as I did.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I hope so as well. It's my personal favorite out of the books I've read.
That's great. My last question is a freebie, so I always like to give my authors the chance to talk about whatever they like. If I didn't mention it yet, um, here's a chance to just ramble about your favorite thing from either book. Two freebies this time.
Two freebies. That's great. I think my favorite thing with Coaltown is the setting. It's just such a desolate, dark, kind of a haunting place even before they find the monsters in the mines. And that was just a lot of fun to play around with. Who hasn't thought about going out into the woods and coming across something like that when it's dark and no one is around and you can't see the porch light anymore? So getting to explore that setting with such a large cast of personalities was just a lot of fun, and it's something I'm really looking forward to expanding on in the sequel as well. I think if I had to pick a favorite thing for I Drowned in the Summer of '85, I think it really would just be what we already discussed with the progression of the time loop and seeing the same thing again and again, and the concept of that being the ghost. I think they're such a fascinating supernatural creature because they can be anything. They're anger and grief and confusion, and in this instance it was just that one thing you couldn't move on from, and the fact it was a haunting, and it's a horror book, but there's that underlying layer of coming to terms with yourself. Not that I'll say exactly what it is, but the final ending scene was just a real treat to write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I can definitely see that. With Coaltown and the monsters, one of my favorite things about it was that it's a lot of found footage. While they're at the mines, they find documents and things telling them what really happened here, and it reframes everything in the story up until that point, and you're like, oh no, the implications. And I think that those scenes were some of my favorites, where they're suddenly coming to terms with and realizing what actually happened here, and just how high the stakes really are, and they didn't know it before. And it really helps drive home how alone they are in that environment. And I just thought that was great. And with the time loop, too, I mean, it's a horror book, but it also felt really melancholy to me because Jacob, the dead kid, is the most upbeat character in the book. Like, he's so cheerful, he doesn't realize he's dead. And he's just having a good time and trying to go for a midnight swim. And he doesn't realize what's about to happen to him because he's reliving the night before he died. And so the fact that the dead kid is the comic relief adds a whole extra element of like existentialism, I guess. But it really helped to frame the time loop too, because Bobby keeps trying to do things to break out of the time loop. And ultimately, like lighting a fire pit or trying to distract Jacob, like none of them work, because that's not how grief works. No matter how many times you revisit the what ifs, you can't change the past. And I thought you did a really good job of showing that in a way that was really heartfelt and also heart wrenching.
Thank you. Those were some really fun scenes. The found footage was something I haven't seen done in my own personal works before, Coaltown. So it was a fun experiment on my end and a way to push my own limits a little bit. But I also just thought it worked so well for that group of characters, where, like you said, it paired with the isolation in a way that made that divide seem so much larger. And then maintaining the camera throughout. Andrew never goes anywhere without it. Even when they're running from the monsters, he makes sure he has it. And, that's what's fascinated me about found footage, because the camera is almost your last connection with something beyond where you're at. It's the one thing that bridges that isolation and almost gives you this hope of someone's going to find the camera, someone's going to see what happened,
Yeah.
and hopefully you'll still be there with it, but otherwise.
Yeah, I hope I hope if somebody I hope that if I die, somebody finds this footage. Adds a whole nother element to the. This was supposed to be my thesis project and my homework assignment, and it's become a death trap. Um, it's just a really sweet dichotomy, and the irony was not lost on me nor on Andrew, I think.
I hope not. I think it was the defining point for the shift between they're having a good time to suddenly they're not. And that actually ties back to what you said about I Drowned in the Summer of '85 as well, in regards to Jacob's character being the most upbeat and the happiest of them, and just looking to have a good time, because I think that's a really important element to horror in general. If it's just this constant grudge of everything is terrible, that's exhausting as a reader to try and get through. But you also want to be smart about how you put it in. Like you said, the almost morbidity of the fact that Jacob is just looking forward to taking that swim makes the grief and everything else that much more difficult. And I think that's how grief works too, because you'll be shopping one day and everything's fine, and then you're crying and it's not. And it's this balance between the two.
Yeah, there's this sense that you want to tell him he's completely oblivious that he's going to die when he takes that swim. But both Bobby and the reader are completely powerless to warn him. And I think that's what makes it really compelling, and that it does keep re-hitting you at the most random of times. It works really well. So um, I'm very happy that I had the chance to read these books, and I'm looking forward to. I think you said I Drowned in the Summer of '85 is a standalone, right? But
Yeah,
Coaltown has a sequel, or it's part of a trilogy.
it is part of the trilogy. And with any luck, if my writing goes according to plan, the sequel should hopefully be out this year as well.
Awesome! Congratulations. What else do you have going on, and where can we find all of your work?
Well, the sequel, Gorehounds, is my main focus, but I always have several projects going on at once. It's, in my opinion, the best way to stay focused on one project is to know you can take a break with another. Um, the other project that I am closest to finishing would be a possession horror called The Possession of Joshua Rowe. So I'm hoping that one's out, maybe not this year, but definitely next year. And my update, the places to follow along would be Tumblr and Patreon under Abalone Tea. And I actually think outside of Amazon, those are the three places my work's at.
Awesome. I'll be sure to link everything in the description of this video. And thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was absolutely awesome to get to come on and talk to you again.
Always a pleasure.